Good morning from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. You're looking live at Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. I'm Stephen Clark, editor of SpaceflightNow.com, and we're here today covering another Falcon 9 launch by SpaceX, carrying another batch of Starlink Internet satellites into orbit. Liftoff is 1 hour, 6 minutes away. That is 10:50 a.m. Eastern Time or 14:50 UTC for those of you in other time zones. Out at pad 40 this morning, the Falcon 9 is vertical. As you can see, it was rolled out overnight to the pad from the hangar just south of Complex 40. And then it was raised vertical in the very early hours this morning in preparation for today's launch attempt. Weather conditions are favorable here at Kennedy Space Center and at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, with a better than 90% chance of favorable conditions for liftoff today. There are some scattered clouds over the launch pad right now, but these are thin clouds and not a concern for weather. Winds are also fairly moderate, not close to the criteria limit for a Falcon 9 launch. The weather outlook, as was issued yesterday, predicted a low to moderate risk of upper-level winds that may be unfavorable for the launch. Again, that is a low to moderate risk, and the weather team sends up weather balloons into the upper atmosphere throughout the countdown before every launch here on the Space Coast of Florida to monitor wind direction and wind speeds at various heights in the atmosphere. And the data from those weather balloons will actually be analyzed by SpaceX, and SpaceX engineers will determine if the Falcon 9 will be able to handle the upper-level winds based on those weather balloon observations. This is often a variable limit, a variable criteria. It depends a lot on wind shear and at the altitude and direction and speed of the different winds at altitude. So it's often a day of launch decision within the countdown, within the final minutes of the launch countdown, to determine whether those upper level winds will be acceptable. But again, we don't expect that to be a concern today, but it is notable that it's a low to moderate risk of upper level wind concerns. It's usually a low risk on the weather forecast chart. So we'll be monitoring any word from SpaceX on the status of the upper level winds, but right now everything looks to be on track for liftoff in 1 hour and 4 minutes with the 54 more Starlink Internet satellites. The countdown for today's Falcon 9 launch here at Cape Canaveral is passing the T-minus 60-minute mark. So we're now 1 hour away from the launch opportunity at 10:50 a.m. Eastern Time, or 14:50 UTC. For those of you who keep track of exact or precise launch times with seconds, the target launch time today is 10:50 a.m. and 40 seconds. That is 10:50:40 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, and that is 14:50:40 UTC. Less than an hour away. SpaceX has 3 instantaneous launch opportunities today for this mission. The first of these is at 10:50 a.m. Eastern Time. There are 2 backup launch times available later this morning and also this afternoon, and we'll discuss those if those become necessary for SpaceX to use. You're continuing to look at a live view of Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, where the Falcon 9 is standing 229 feet or 70 meters tall, 59 minutes from liftoff time. If you're just joining us and haven't had a chance to do so, please hit the like button here on our YouTube stream. That really helps us gain a larger audience and a bigger following for this launch and for our live stream. So again, please hit the like button here on YouTube if you haven't done so already. That really helps us a lot. Again, this mission is launching 54 Starlink Internet satellites. Those satellites are packaged inside the nose cone or payload fairing of the Falcon 9 for liftoff today. It'll take about 15 minutes for the Falcon 9 to climb off the pad and accelerate into orbit and get into the proper orbit and altitude for deployment of the 54 Starlink satellites. That separation is planned at about 15.5 minutes into the flight. And at that point is when SpaceX will be able to declare mission success, at least from the Falcon 9 rocket's perspective, once the launcher's upper stage places these satellites at the proper altitude and inclination to begin their journeys into the Starlink constellation. The Starlink Internet fleet currently provides Internet service to more than 40 countries around the world. Japan is one of the newest nations and markets that is opened up to the Starlink network. So consumers in Japan now have access to the internet services beamed down by these satellites. T-minus 57 minutes and 25 seconds and counting. No issues that we are aware of at this point in the countdown, but we'll continue tracking that and be back with another update shortly. Now 42 minutes 30 seconds away from the first of 3 available launch opportunities that SpaceX has today. This first launch opportunity is at 10:50 a.m. and 40 seconds Eastern Time. That's 14:50:40 UTC. Again, you're looking at a live view of Space Launch Complex 40, where the Falcon 9 is vertical in preparation for its launch today with 54 Starlink Internet satellites. In the next 5 minutes or so, we expect to hear an update from SpaceX on whether they're going to proceed with the launch attempt at the first of today's launch opportunities. Right now, there's no indication that they will not proceed with that opportunity this morning at 10:50 a.m. If they are proceeding, propellant loading on board the Falcon 9 should get underway at T-minus 35 minutes, which is less than 7 minutes away. About 1 million pounds of kerosene and liquid oxygen propellants will be loaded into the 2-stage Falcon 9 rocket for the countdown for the final 35 minutes of the countdown. The kerosene is known as RP1, or Rocket Propellant 1. This is a highly refined rocket-grade kerosene that is burned by the Merlin engines on both the first and second stages of the Falcon 9 rocket. Both stages also consume liquid oxygen as an oxidizer. The liquid oxygen is stored several hundred degrees below zero. So both stages have liquid oxygen and kerosene tanks that will be filled during the final 35 minutes of the countdown. So the countdown has passed T-minus 35 minutes, and we have not been able to confirm from SpaceX the start of propellant loading, so we're not quite sure whether the team is proceeding for liftoff at the first of today's 3 launch opportunities, which again is at 10:50 a.m. Eastern Time. SpaceX typically opens up their mission audio lines to us, to the public, before the start of propellant loading, and that has not begun this morning. So we're going to stand by for updates, and we'll pass those along to you, whether 10:50 a.m. remains the target launch time or if it will be later today. Now 30 minutes from launch time. If you're watching our live view of Pad 40, we can now see some vapors and frost building up on the first stage of the Falcon 9, so this does confirm that propellant loading is underway, and the countdown looks to be on track for liftoff at 10:50 a.m. Eastern Time. That's 14:50 UTC. Again, we would normally be including updates from SpaceX Launch Control, some periodic audio callouts from SpaceX Launch Control here on our stream, but SpaceX has not opened that line for us yet this morning. We're not sure if that's an oversight or some technical issue with their communications team there, but we can confirm that propellant loading is underway at Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, and launch appears to be on schedule for 10:50 a.m. Eastern Time, 14:50 UTC. SpaceX's mission audio line is now up, and we hope to be piping those updates into our stream, so you'll be able to hear those on this stream momentarily for the remainder of the countdown. Now 26 minutes and 30 seconds until liftoff. Now 24 minutes, 40 seconds until liftoff time. Everything looking good for an on-time launch today at 10:50 a.m. Eastern Time. That is 10:40 a.m. to be precise. Eastern Time, for those of you in other time zones, in a Universal Time, that is 2:50 p.m. and 40 seconds. now inside of 20 minutes and 30 seconds until liftoff. We're now seeing the big vent from the strong back.
Stage 2, RP1 load complete.
And we're now also hearing commentary, some periodic updates from SpaceX Launch Control that the second stage RP1 load is complete. So the second stage of the Falcon 9 is now full of rocket-grade kerosene fuel. And this vent that you're seeing from the strongback out at pad 40, the strongback is the mast, by the way, the structure just to the right of the Falcon 9 rocket. The vent that you're seeing now is marking the start of chill down of the liquid oxygen loading line that leads up the strongback from the ground storage tank for liquid oxygen into the second stage. And this is thermal conditioning of that line in preparation for the flow of liquid oxygen to begin loading the second stage of the Falcon 9 oxidizer tank at T-minus 16 minutes. So right now, propellants continue loading onto stage 1, kerosene and liquid oxygen. And on stage 2, the kerosene tank is fully loaded, and the liquid oxygen tank is now preparing to be loaded with this chill down that you're seeing out there at pad 40 with this vent is the visual sign that this thermal conditioning has begun. We're now seeing the end of that vent of oxygen vapor from the strongback at pad 40, and we expect in a few moments to hear confirmation that liquid oxygen loading is underway on the second stage.
Stage 2 LOX load has started.
And there's the call from SpaceX Launch Control right on time that the stage 2 liquid oxygen load is underway. Again, SpaceX is counting down to liftoff of the Falcon 9 rocket with 54 more Starlink internet satellites heading to orbit this morning from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. The photo you're seeing here is a file photo from a previous Starlink mission, but it shows what the stack of Starlink satellites looks like inside the payload shroud of the Falcon 9. These 54 satellites are packed one on top of the other, held down onto an adapter, and then that adapter is attached to the stage 2 structure of the Falcon 9 rocket. 4 retention rods keep the Starlink satellites firmly attached to the rocket during their stay on the launch pad as well as the climb into orbit. And then once the Falcon 9 reaches the proper orbit, those retention rods jettison, allowing the 54 Starlink satellites to fly free of the rocket. And at that point, SpaceX will be able to declare mission success, at least from the Falcon 9's perspective, that it put these satellites where they intended to go on this mission. Again, there are 54 Starlink satellites on board. These satellites each weigh between 250 and 300 kilograms. They're outfitted with inter-satellite laser links to allow the satellites to actually pass data between one another. This kind of streamlines the network and allows the network to function without the need of so many ground stations to transmit data to and from. These satellites will deploy their solar panels after reaching orbit. After deploying from the Falcon 9 rocket, they'll extend these solar arrays, and then they'll activate their ion propulsion systems and begin climbing from their drop-off orbit, which is at an altitude of roughly 100 to 200 miles, to an operating altitude of 335 miles. These satellites are heading into what's known as shell number 4 of the Starlink constellation. So the Starlink architecture has 5 shells at different altitudes and different inclinations. Some are at mid-inclination orbits, like today's mission is heading to. Some are in polar orbits that are generally accessible with launches out at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. And all of these satellites are virtually identical and are built in an assembly line in a rapid production fashion at SpaceX's Starlink facility in Redmond, Washington. There are this mission today, launching 54 satellites, will actually surpass the 3,500 satellite point in the Starlink deployment. There are currently about 3,100 satellites that are currently active in the Starlink network. A few hundred have actually been deorbited or decommissioned or ran into issues and were never put into service. So about 3,100 are active. The total number of Starlinks launched after today's mission will surpass 3,500. This photo shows what a Starlink user terminal looks like. I mentioned earlier that the Starlink service is now available in more than 40 countries and territories. It's used, for example, in rural households, schools, homes, businesses. It's also used on the front lines of the war in Ukraine. The Ukrainian military forces are now relying more and more on the Starlink service to maintain communications lines as conventional terrestrial cell phone networks and internet networks are put out of commission by Russia's military. And SpaceX has donated thousands of Starlink user terminals to Ukraine for use by not only by civilians but also largely by Ukrainian military forces to keep up their communications links and fight the Russian military during the invasion of Ukraine. The newest Starlink market is currently Japan. That was announced just last week by SpaceX. That's the first country in Asia to use the Starlink network, to open up a new market there. Now 12 minutes and 18 seconds until the launch opportunity today at 10:50 a.m. Eastern Time. Now 11 minutes and 33 seconds and counting. Here's a look at the countdown timeline. We've already passed a few of these milestones in this morning's countdown. We heard confirmation at T-minus 35 minutes that the propellant loading operation had begun. And then at T-minus 16 minutes, we heard that the second stage of the Falcon 9 rocket was being loaded with liquid oxygen propellant. Looking ahead for the final 10 minutes of the countdown at T-minus 7 minutes, the Falcon 9 will begin chilling down its Merlin first stage engines. That involves flowing a little bit of super cold liquid oxygen through the engine compartment to thermally condition that hardware for ignition. At T-minus 5 minutes and 30 seconds or so, we expect to hear confirmation that the first stage has been fully loaded with kerosene fuel. Again, the second stage was fully loaded earlier in the countdown. At 4.5 minutes, we expect to see the strong back structure just to the right of the Falcon 9 to begin retracting away from the vehicle. It'll recline to about 1.5 degrees away from the vertical Falcon 9 rocket. And then at T-minus 2 minutes, the Falcon 9 should be fully loaded with propellant. The liquid oxygen loading will begin terminating at about that point. And at that point, about 1 million pounds of propellants, kerosene and liquid oxygen, will be loaded into the vehicle. The fill and drain valves will be closed and secured for flight. And then the Falcon 9's onboard computer will take command of the countdown at T-minus 60 seconds. It'll oversee the final steps to configure the launch vehicle for flight. That includes pressurizing the propellant tanks on the Falcon 9 rocket. At T-minus 45 seconds, the SpaceX launch director will voice their final go for launch. And then at T-minus 3 seconds, the engine controller on the Falcon 9 rocket will send the engine ignition command to light the 9 Merlin 1D engines on the bottom of the first stage. That's done using an igniter fluid called TTAB. It's aluminum triethyl borane. If this was a night launch, you might be able to see the green flash of ignition from that igniter fluid. And then after a final health check of the engine performance, the onboard computer will give the command to open hold-down clamps. These 4 clamps that are holding the rocket on the pad will open to allow the Falcon 9 to begin its vertical climb to space. T-minus 9 minutes and 9 seconds and counting. Again, we're about 2 minutes from the engine chill down. That's the next major milestone in the countdown. T-minus 8 minutes, 18 seconds. After liftoff, the Falcon 9 will head northeast from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. This map shows the approximate ground track that we'll see the Falcon 9 take after lifting off from Pad 40. We've labeled Space Launch Complex 40, that is Slick 40 here on this map. And we've also labeled the position of the drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas, holding position about 400 miles or 650 kilometers downrange. That is roughly due east of Charleston, South Carolina, as you can see in this map. This is a very familiar trajectory for those of you who have watched Falcon 9 launches with Starlink satellites. This is heading to, again, shell number 4 of the Starlink network, flying northeast along this red line parallel to the United States East Coast, and then off the coast of the Canadian Maritime Provinces. And then the Falcon 9 will deploy the 54 Starlink satellites into orbit over the North Atlantic Ocean, about halfway between Newfoundland and Ireland, at about 15.5 minutes into the flight. Landing of the first stage on the drone ship, by the way, is scheduled for about 8.5 minutes after launch.
Engine chill has started.
We just heard the call at T-minus 7 minutes that the engine chill has started. This is the process that I mentioned moments ago to thermally condition these 9 Merlin 1D power plants on the bottom of the first stage. So a little bit of liquid oxygen will begin flowing into the engine hardware to thermally condition those components for ignition, because that liquid oxygen is chilled several hundred degrees below zero. They want to make sure that all those engine components, the turbines, the plumbing, are all conditioned and brought down close to that temperature, so they don't suffer any damage and aren't suffer any thermal shock during the ignition sequence. This booster flying today is booster 1062. It's flying for the 10th time today. Here's a look at its flight history. It debuted back on November the 5th of 2020 with the launch of a GPS satellite for the U.S. military. It launched another GPS mission about 6 months later. And then it's also launched 2 crew missions, notably commercial crew missions, the Inspiration 4 private space flight with 4 passengers on board, and the Axiom 1 mission to the ISS with 4 commercial astronauts as well. And it's also launched 4 Starlink missions to date. This will be its 5th Starlink mission. Again, booster 1062 is the booster flying today, going for its 10th flight to space.
Tanks pressing for strong back retract.
In the last few moments, we've heard a couple of calls from SpaceX Launch Control that the first stage is now full of kerosene fuel, so about 46,000 gallons of rocket-grade kerosene has been loaded into the vehicle. Liquid oxygen continues flowing into the rocket at this point. That will be terminated at about T-2 minutes. And the next step we expect to see is retraction of the strongback.
Strongback retract has started.
Now, inside of 3.5 minutes until liftoff, the strongback, as you can see, has retracted to an angle of about 1.5 degrees from the Falcon 9 rocket. It will retract further at liftoff. The next calls we expect to hear will be the termination of liquid oxygen loading.
Stage 1 lock load complete.
There's stage 1 lock slow complete, so the first stage liquid oxygen tank is now full. Second stage liquid oxygen loading will continue for a few more minutes, or another minute or so. Now inside of 2 minutes until launch. Everything looking good for an on-time liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket at Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station.
Stage 2 lock load complete.
And there is the call from SpaceX Launch Control that second stage liquid oxygen loading has been completed. So about 1 million pounds of propellants have been loaded into the rocket over the last half hour. And the rocket is fully loaded for launch.
Ground closeouts have started.
Coming up on T-minus 60 seconds, that's when the Falcon 9 rocket's onboard computer will take command of the countdown.
Falcon 9 is in startup.
And we just heard the call that Falcon 9 is in startup. The onboard computer now controlling the final 60 seconds of the countdown. Propellant tanks will be brought up to flight pressure.
LD Lee, go for launch.
And there's the final call from SpaceX's launch director that he is go for launch. T-minus 30 seconds. T-minus 15 seconds. T-minus 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Engine start and liftoff. Liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket on the Starlink 436 mission. T-plus 20 seconds, Falcon 9 heading downrange, vectoring its thrust to head northeast from Cape Canaveral. And Falcon 9 has disappeared into the cloud cover here over Florida Space Coast, but we're hearing the loud rumble from the 9 Merlin engines here. We're now switching to an onboard camera view from SpaceX, and also a tracking camera from SpaceX to follow the Falcon 9's ascent into the sky over Cape Canaveral. Falcon 9 is now supersonic. Now about a minute into the flight. Now, 90 seconds into the flight, the chill down of the Merlin vacuum engine on the second stage has begun. This thermally conditions that Merlin vacuum engine for its startup sequence. Less than a minute remaining in the first stage burn. So in less than a minute, in about 45 seconds, we expect to see a main engine cutoff. That's when the 9 Merlin engines on the first stage will shut down. And then a few moments later, we should see stage separation and then ignition of the second stage engine. Some spectacular views from an onboard camera moments ago, showing the engine plume expanding as the rocket climbs into the thinner layers of the upper atmosphere. And you can see the curvature of Earth and the blackness of space there on the horizon. Beautiful views from the Falcon 9. We've heard verbal confirmation of main engine cutoff and stage separation. And ignition of the second stage has been confirmed, and also payload fairing separation. Some of these views from the onboard camera from the Falcon 9 come with a few seconds delay. So we did hear confirmation of payload fairing jettison a few seconds ago, but we just saw that visually in the onboard camera view. Now, passing 4 minutes into the flight, we're still seeing some spectacular views from onboard cameras. aboard SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. These views are being provided by SpaceX. On the right, you see the engine on the second stage glowing red hot, that engine bell glowing normally. That is a normal feature of its performance, of its firing. On the left, you can see a view from the first stage booster with its grid fins extended. Those grid fins are made of titanium. They're used to help steer and stabilize the rocket as it falls back into the atmosphere. It's heading for the landing on the drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas downrange in the Atlantic Ocean. SpaceX confirming both vehicles, the first stage and second stage, are following the expected trajectory this morning. The first stage has now reached its apogee, the highest point of its flight, and is now descending back toward Earth's surface. The second stage continues firing its engine, accelerating to orbital velocity. The Falcon 9 is heading northeast, parallel to the east coast of the United States. This map shows the locations of the second stage flying just off the coast of the Carolinas, and the first stage having again passed the apogee of its trajectory, the highest point of its flight today, and beginning its descent to the drone ship. We've heard verbal confirmation from SpaceX Launch Control that the entry burn is underway on the first stage. We'll stand by to see that visually, hopefully in a few moments. There it is. Three Merlin engines firing to slow the rocket down for re-entry. And we've also heard verbal confirmation that the engines have shut down. Again, these videos from SpaceX come with a little bit of lag, so we're hearing verbal call-outs before we see visual evidence of these events. The T plus 7 minutes and 20 seconds into the flight, again, we've seen a good entry burn from the first stage booster. We're now showing a full screen shot of the Merlin vacuum engine on the second stage. About a minute or so remaining until the nearly simultaneous events, which will be the landing of the first stage and SECO, or second stage engine cutoff. And there's the call of a stage 1 landing burn. Again, the lag on the video is about 15 or so seconds. So we hope to see that landing burn underway. There it is. Standing by for touchdown on the drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas. So a lot of action there in the last few seconds. You saw the successful landing of the first stage booster on the drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas. This booster is tail number 1062 in SpaceX's fleet and has now completed its 10th flight to space. And we also heard the call that the Stage 2 engine has completed its burn to place the 54 Starlink Internet satellites into the proper orbit for deployment. That spacecraft separation event is about 6 minutes away. So Falcon 9 has reached orbit with its second stage, and the first stage booster is back on the drone ship after its 10th flight to space. This drone ship will return the rocket to Port Canaveral in the next few days.
Expected loss of signal, J6 and PPF.
And then the rocket will be refurbished for a future flight.
Expected loss of signal, Bermuda.
Now about 3 minutes away from the expected time of spacecraft separation. That's when these 54 Starlink satellites will release from the Falcon 9's second stage. You can see the rocket is now passing over the North Atlantic Ocean just east of Newfoundland. T plus 14 minutes 10 seconds, about a minute and 10 seconds remaining until the expected time of payload deployment. To prepare for the separation of the Starlink satellites, the second stage actually spins up to put itself into a bit of a spin maneuver that creates some force that enables the Starlink satellites to actually fly free of the rocket without the need of any ejection springs or anything like that, as other payloads often use. So the Falcon 9 will actually put itself into a spin with its second stage thrusters, and then release these 4 retention rods, and at that point the satellites will be free to fly away from the Falcon 9 rocket, as they will naturally do. We're not going to see any onboard views of this event because SpaceX has concluded their live video coverage of this launch, but they're still providing us audio updates and this tracking map showing the location of the rocket over the North Atlantic Ocean. So we should hear the call for payload deployment in a few moments, and we'll listen in for that.
Starlink separation confirmed.
And SpaceX has confirmed Starlink separation, so 54 more Starlink satellites are now in orbit after a deployment over the North Atlantic Ocean. The satellites and the rocket are heading toward Europe at this hour, flying at a speed of nearly 8 kilometers per second, or about 5 miles per second in low Earth orbit. So the Starlink satellites will deploy their solar panels after separating from each other through differential drag. Those solar panels will begin generating electricity, and the satellites will actually run through automated health checks. They do self-checks.
Signal Bermuda. Go ahead, Haley.
They do self-checks of their status after deployment, and then after deploying their solar panels, they will activate their ion thrusters, which use krypton gas as a fuel to climb from their drop-off orbit, which is about 100 to 200 miles above the Earth, to an operating altitude of about 335 miles, or 540 kilometers. That will take, depending on which orbital plane in the network these satellites are going to, anywhere from a few weeks to a few months to perform that orbit raising and drift maneuver before entering commercial service. Again, these satellites bring the total number of Starlink spacecraft launched by SpaceX to date to 3,505. About 3,100 of these satellites are currently functioning and active in orbit. Several hundred more have been decommissioned or failed after their launch, or were test beds or prototypes that were not meant for commercial service. So now more than 3,100 satellites active in the Starlink network, and 3,500 is the total number of Starlinks that have been launched to date, dating back to actually 2018 when the first prototypes were launched. This mission today marked the 182nd launch of a Falcon 9 rocket since 2010. The very first Falcon 9 launch took off from Pad 40, the pad we saw in use today, on June the 4th of 2010. So 182 Falcon 9 missions have flown to date. This was the 190th launch of SpaceX's Falcon rocket family. This includes the Falcon 1 and Falcon Heavy configurations as well. This booster, as we've mentioned, Booster 1062 completed its 10th flight to space today. This was the 156th Falcon 9 launch from here in Florida, the 101st from Pad 40, and the 156th launch overall from Pad 40. This includes 55 launches of Titan rockets that date back to the 1960s. The Falcon 9, SpaceX began operating Pad 40 in 2008 and launched the first Falcon 9 in 2010. And the last Titan rocket took off from Pad 40 in 2005. This was the 123rd Falcon 9 mission of those 182 that has used a reused booster. This was the 64th SpaceX launch primarily dedicated to launching Starlink satellites. This was the 48th SpaceX Falcon 9 launch of the year, extending the record for number of launches in a calendar year. And here locally at Cape Canaveral and at Kennedy Space Center, this was the 46th orbital launch attempt from launch pads here in Florida so far in 2022, also extending the record, which before 2022 was 32. And we're at 46 now, and it looks like we have about a dozen or so to go this calendar year as schedules currently stack up. So the Cape could be approaching the 60 launch threshold in 2022 when all is said and done. You're looking now live at Pad 40, the empty launch pad where the Falcon 9 took off 20 minutes ago at 10:50 a.m. Eastern Time, carrying 54 Starlink internet satellites into orbit. So with this mission, Starlink 4-36 now in the books, here's a look ahead at the next few launches on our calendar. Coming up in just a couple of days' time, SpaceX's rival internet network constellation, OneWeb, will be returning to action with a launch from India. This will mark the first OneWeb launch since February. OneWeb had planned these launches on Russian Soyuz rockets. However, that contract is no longer in effect after Russia's invasion of Ukraine and souring relations between Russia and the West. OneWeb opted to look to alternative launch providers after Russia basically refused to launch future OneWeb missions without concessions from Western countries. So OneWeb has turned to India and to SpaceX to launch their remaining constellation. The next mission, the first of these remaining missions, is set to launch on Saturday from the Satish Dhawan Space Center on India's east coast on a geosynchronous launch vehicle Mark III vehicle carrying about 36 OneWeb satellites into orbit on this mission. Again, this launch is scheduled for Saturday from India. Later this month, a couple more SpaceX missions are on the books. On October the 30th, a Falcon 9 rocket is set to launch another batch of Starlink satellites from out at Vandenberg Space Force Base. This mission is known as Starlink 4-31, heading into a very similar orbit as today's mission did from here in Florida. And then on October 31st, SpaceX, a day later, SpaceX is set to launch their next Falcon Heavy rocket. This will be the fourth flight of a Falcon Heavy rocket from Pad 39A at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. We've seen in the last few days SpaceX has been reconfiguring the transporter erector and reaction frame out at Pad 39A for the flight of the Falcon Heavy. The Falcon Heavy is, of course, composed of 3 different Falcon 9 cores bolted side by side together to triple the total liftoff thrust of the Falcon 9. So 27 Merlin engines on the Falcon Heavy at liftoff versus 9 on the Falcon 9 rocket. We expect to see that strong rollback into the hangar at Pad 39A in the coming days, perhaps before the end of the week if schedules hold. And then it'll pick up the Falcon 9 rocket. It will be integrated with the Falcon Heavy rocket inside the hangar, and will return to the pad. It will be lifted vertical for a static fire test next week. And then if that static fire test goes well, SpaceX plans to roll the rocket back into the hangar again for integration with the payload. The payload for this mission is a top secret payload for the United States Space Force. Very few details have been released about the payload. It's carrying at least 2 satellites, perhaps more. We know the identity and some basic information about one of them. We'll be performing technology experiments in geosynchronous orbit. The other payload or payloads remain secret and undisclosed by the Space Force at this time. But this will be the first operational national security mission to actually launch on a Falcon Heavy rocket. Liftoff is scheduled for roughly 9:45 a.m. Eastern Time on October 31st on Halloween. That is 13:45 UTC. And then following that Falcon Heavy, just 1 day later, another major U.S. launch is scheduled from Vandenberg Space Force Base out in California again. This will be a United Launch Alliance Atlas V rocket with NOAA's Joint Polar Satellite System #2 satellite. This is called JPSS-2. This is a polar orbiting weather satellite for NOAA and NASA. And a secondary payload on this mission is known as Lofted, which will test an inflatable heat shield that will be demonstrated during re-entry, and it will demonstrate technology that ULA hopes to use in the future for recovery of booster engines on its future Vulcan rocket. This mission is noteworthy in the fact that it's going to be the final Atlas V launch from the West Coast out in California. And after this launch on November the 1st, Space Launch Complex 3 East will begin to be reconfigured for future launches of the Vulcan rocket with United Launch Alliance. So this will be the final ULA launch from out in California for at least several years, actually, while that reconfiguration of the pad takes place. So that's the launch schedule in the next few weeks. With confirmed launch dates, there may be other launches that may pop up, such as Chinese launches. We don't have confirmed dates often for those until notices to pilots are released and maritime warning notices are released. But those dates I've shared are what we have confirmed on our calendar. At this point, we're going to conclude our coverage, but before we do, we want to invite you to please support our coverage. If you want to do that, you can do that by becoming a member of our YouTube channel. Just click join here on YouTube. We have different membership tiers available for you to choose from, and depending on which level you select, you can gain access to exclusive video features, and you'll be supporting our coverage. You'll be helping us continue to bring you live events like this launch we brought you this morning from Cape Canaveral and Kennedy Space Center. So until next time, I'm Stephen Clark, reporting live from Kennedy Space Center. Thanks for joining us. Have a great day.